Chapter 8. Arthur Underwood was a middle-ranking magician who worked for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. A solitary man of a somewhat cantankerous nature, he lived with his wife Martha in a tall Georgian house in Highgate. Mr. Underwood had never had an apprentice, and nor did he want one. He was quite happy working on his own. But he knew that sooner or later, like all other magicians, he would have to take his turn and accept a child into his house. Sure enough, the inevitable happened. One day a letter arrived from the Employment Ministry containing the dreaded request. With grim resignation, Mr. Underwood carried out his duty. On the appointed afternoon, he traveled to the ministry to collect his nameless charge. He ascended the marbled steps between two granite pillars and entered the echoing foyer. It was a vast, featureless space. Office workers passed quietly back and forth between wooden doors on either side, their shoes making respectful pattering noises on the floor. Across the hall, two statues of past employment ministers had been built on a heroic scale, and sandwiched between them was a desk piled high with papers. Mr. Underwood approached. It was only when he actually reached the desk that he was able to glimpse, behind the bristling rampart of bulging files, the face of a small, smiling clerk.
"Hello, sir,"
said the clerk.
"Junior Minister Underwood. I'm here to collect my new apprentice." "Ah, yes, sir. I was expecting you. If you'll just sign a few documents."
The clerk rummaged in a nearby stack.
"Won't take a minute. Then you can pick him up from the day room." "Him? It's a boy, then." "A boy, 5 years old. Very bright if the tests are anything to go by. Obviously a little upset at the moment."
The clerk located a wad of papers and withdrew a pen from behind his ear.
"If you could initial each page and sign on the dotted lines."
Mr. Underwood flourished the pen.
"His parents. They've left, I take it." "Yes, sir. They couldn't get away fast enough. The usual sort. Take the money and run, if you get my meaning, sir. Barely stopped to say goodbye to him. And all the normal safety procedures? His birth records have been removed and destroyed, sir. And he has been strictly instructed to forget his birth name and not to reveal it to anyone. He is now officially unformed. You can start with him from scratch." "Very well."
With a sigh, Mr. Underwood completed his last spidery signature and passed the documents back.
"If that's all, I suppose I'd better collect him."
He passed down a series of silent corridors and through a heavy paneled door to a brightly painted room that had been filled with toys for the entertainment of unhappy children. There, between a grimacing rocking horse and a plastic wizard doll wearing a comedy conical hat, they found a small, pale-faced boy. It had been crying in the recent past, but had now fortunately desisted. Two red-rimmed eyes looked up at him blankly. Mr. Underwood cleared his throat.
"I'm Underwood, your master. Your true life begins now. Come with me."
The child gave a loud sniff. Mr. Underwood noticed its chin wobbling dangerously. With some distaste, he took the boy by the hand, pulled it to its feet, and led it out down echoing corridors to his waiting car. On the journey back to Highgate, the magician once or twice tried to engage the child in conversation, but was met with teary silence. This did not please him. With a sort of frustration, he gave it up and turned on the radio to catch the cricket scores. The child sat stock still in the back seat, gazing at its knees. His wife met them at the door. She carried a tray of biscuits and a steaming mug of hot chocolate, and straightway bustled the boy into a cozy sitting room where a fire leaped in the grate.
"You won't get any sense out of him, Martha,"
Mr. Underwood grunted.
"Hasn't said a word. Do you wonder? He's terrified, poor thing. Leave him to me.
Mrs. Underwood was a diminutive, roundish woman with very white hair cropped short. She sat the boy in a chair by the fire and offered him a biscuit. He didn't acknowledge her at all. Half an hour passed. Mrs. Underwood chatted pleasantly about anything that came into her head. The boy drank some chocolate and nibbled a biscuit, but otherwise stared silently into the fire. Finally, Mrs. Underwood made a decision. She sat beside him and put her arm around his shoulders.
Now, dear,
She said,
let's make a deal. I know that you've been told not to tell anyone your name, but you can make an exception with me. I can't get to know you properly just calling you boy, can I? So, if you tell me your name, I'll tell you mine, in strictest confidence. What do you think? Was that a nod? Very well, then. I'm Martha. And you are?
a small snuffle, a smaller voice.
Nathaniel? That's a lovely name, dear. And don't worry, I won't tell a soul. Don't you feel better already? Now have another biscuit, Nathaniel, and I'll show you to your bedroom.
With the child fed and bathed and finally put to bed, Mrs. Underwood reported back to her husband, who was working in his study.
He's asleep at last, she said. It wouldn't surprise me if he was in shock. And no wonder, his parents leaving him like that. I think it's disgraceful, ripping a child from his home so young. That's how it's always been done, Martha. Apprentices have to come from somewhere.
The magician kept his head bent meaningfully towards his book. His wife did not take the hint.
He should be allowed to stay with his family, she went on, or at least see them sometimes.
Wearily, Mr. Underwood placed the book on the table.
You know very well that is quite impossible. His birth name must be forgotten, or else future enemies will use it to harm him. How can it be forgotten if his family keeps in contact? Besides, no one has forced his parents to part with their brat. They didn't want him. That's the truth of it, Martha, or they wouldn't have answered the advertisements. It's quite straightforward. They get a considerable amount of money as compensation. He gets a chance to serve his country at the highest level, and the state gets a new apprentice. Simple. Everyone wins. No one loses out. All the same, it didn't do me any harm, Martha.
Mr. Underwood reached for his book.
It would be a lot less cruel if magicians were allowed their own children. That road leads to competing dynasties, family alliances. It all ends in blood feuds. Read your history books, Martha. See what happened in Italy. So don't worry about the boy. He's young. He'll forget soon enough. Now, what about making me some supper?
The magician Underwood's house was the kind of building that presented a slender, simple, dignified countenance to the street, but which extended back for a remarkable distance in a confusion of stairs, corridors, and slightly varying levels. There were 5 main floors altogether, a cellar filled with wine racks, mushroom boxes, and cases of drying fruit. The ground floor, containing reception room, dining hall, kitchen, and conservatory. 2 upper floors, mainly consisting of bathrooms, bedrooms, and workrooms, and at the very top, an attic. It was here that Nathaniel slept, under a steeply sloping ceiling of whitewashed rafters. Each morning, at dawn, he was awoken by the fluting clamor of pigeons on the roof above. A small skylight was set in the ceiling. Through it, if he stood on a chair, he could see out over the gray, rain-washed London horizon. The house stood on a hill, and the view was good. On clear days, he could see the Crystal Palace radio mast far away on the other side of the city. His bedroom was furnished with a cheap plywood wardrobe, a small chest of drawers, a desk and chair, and a bedside bookcase. Every week, Mrs. Underwood placed a new cutting of garden flowers in a vase on the desk. From that first miserable day, the magician's wife had taken Nathaniel under her wing. She liked the boy and was kind to him. In the privacy of the house, she often addressed the apprentice by his birth name, despite the stern displeasure of her husband.
"We shouldn't even know the brat's name,"
He told her.
"It's forbidden. He could be compromised. When he is 12 and is coming of age, he will be given his new name, by which he will be known as Magician and Man for the rest of his life. In the meantime, it is quite wrong."
"Who's going to notice?" she protested. "No one. It gives the poor lad comfort." She was the only person to use his name. His tutors called him Underwood after his master. His master himself just addressed him as Boy. In return for her affection, Nathaniel rewarded Mrs. Underwood with open devotion. He hung on her every word and followed her directions in everything. At the end of his first week at the house, she brought a present to his room. "This is for you," she said. "It's a bit old and dreary, but I thought you might like it." It was a painting of boats sailing up a creek, surrounded by mudflats and low countryside. The varnish was so dark with age that the details could hardly be made out, but Nathaniel loved it instantly. He watched Mrs. Underwood hang it on the wall above his desk. "You're to be a magician, Nathaniel," she said, "and that is the greatest privilege that any boy or girl could have. Your parents have made the ultimate sacrifice by giving you up for this noble destiny. No, don't cry, dear. So in turn, you must be strong, strive as hard as you can, and learn everything your tutors ask of you. By doing that, you will honor both your parents and yourself. Come over to the window. Stand on that chair. Now, look over there. Do you see that little tower in the distance? That one? No, that's an office block, dear. The little brown one over on the left? That's it. That's the Houses of Parliament, my dear, where all the finest magicians go to rule Britain and our empire. Mr. Underwood goes there all the time, and if you work hard and do everything your master tells you, one day you will go there too, and I will be as proud of you as can be." "Yes, Mrs. Underwood." He stared at the tower until his eyes ached, fixing its position firmly in his mind. To go to Parliament. One day it would be so. He would indeed work hard and make her proud. With time and the constant ministrations of Mrs. Underwood, Nathaniel's homesickness began to fade. Memory of his distant parents dimmed, and the pain inside him grew ever less, and he had almost forgotten its existence. A strict routine of work and study helped with this process. It took up nearly all his time and left him little space to brood. On weekdays, the routine began with Mrs. Underwood rousing him with a double tap on his bedroom door. "Tea outside, on the step. Mouth, not toes." This call was a ritual stemming from one morning when, on his way downstairs to the bathroom, Nathaniel had charged out of his bedroom in a befuddled state, made precise contact between foot and mug, and sent a tidal wave of hot tea crashing against the landing wall. The stain was still visible years later, like the imprint of a gout of blood. Fortunately, his master had not discovered this disaster. He never ascended to the attic. After washing in the bathroom on the level below, Nathaniel would dress himself in shirt, gray trousers, long gray socks, smart black shoes, and, if it was winter and the house was cold, a thick Aran jumper that Mrs. Underwood had bought for him. He would brush his hair carefully in front of a tall mirror in the bathroom, running his eyes over the thin, neat figure with the pale face gazing back at him. Then he descended by the back stairs to the kitchen, carrying his schoolwork. While Mrs. Underwood fixed the cornflakes and toast, he would try to finish the homework left over from the night before. Mrs. Underwood frequently did her best to help him.
Azerbaijan? The capital's Baku, I think. Baku? Yes. Look in your atlas. What are you learning that for? Mr. Purcell says I have to master the Middle East this week. Learn the countries and stuff. Don't look so down. Toast's ready. Well, it is important that you learn all that stuff. You have to know the background before you can get to the interesting bits. But it's so boring. That's all you know. I've been to Azerbaijan. Baku's a bit of a dump, but it is an important center for researching afrits. What are they? Demons of fire, the second most powerful form of spirit. The fiery element is very strong in the mountains of Azerbaijan. That's where the Zoroastrian faith began too. They venerate the divine fire found in all living things. If you're looking for the chocolate spread, it's behind the cereal. Did you see a genie when you were there, Mrs. Underwood? You don't need to go to Baku to find a genie, Nathaniel. And don't speak with your mouth full. You're spraying crumbs all over my tablecloth. No, Jinn will come to you, especially if you're here in London. When will I see a freet? An afreet. Not for a long time, if you know what's good for you. Now finish up quickly. Mr. Purcell will be waiting.
After breakfast, Nathaniel would gather his school books and head upstairs to the first-floor workroom, where Mr. Purcell would indeed be waiting for him. His teacher was a young man with thinning blonde hair, which he frequently smoothed down in a vain effort to hide his scalp. He wore a gray suit that was slightly too big for him, and an alternating sequence of horrible ties. His first name was Walter. Many things made him nervous, and speaking to Mr. Underwood, which he had to on occasions, made him downright twitchy. As a result of his nerves, he took his frustrations out on Nathaniel. He was too honest a man to be really brutal with the boy, who was a competent worker. Instead, he tended to snap tetchily at his mistakes, yipping like a small dog. Nathaniel learned no magic with Mr. Purcell. His teacher did not know any. Instead, he had to apply himself to other subjects, primarily mathematics, modern languages, French, Czech, geography, and history. Politics was also important. Now then, young Underwood, Mr. Purcell would say, what is the chief purpose of our noble government? Nathaniel looked blank. Come on! Come on! To rule us, sir? To protect us! Do not forget that our country is at war. Prague still commands the plains east of Bohemia, and we are struggling to keep her armies out of Italy. These are dangerous times. Agitators and spies are loose in London. If the empire is meant to be kept whole, a strong government must be in place, and strong means magicians. Imagine the country without them. It would be unthinkable. Commoners would be in charge. We would slip into chaos. An invasion would quickly follow. All that stands between us and anarchy is our leaders. This is what you should aspire to, boy. To be a part of the government and rule honorably. Remember that. Yes, sir. Honor is the most important quality for a magician, Mr. Purcell went on. He or she has great power and must use it with discretion. In the past, rogue magicians have attempted to overthrow the state. They have always been defeated. Why? Because true magicians fight with virtue and justice on their side. Mr. Purcell, are you a magician? His teacher smoothed back his hair and sighed. No, Underwood, I was not selected, but I still serve as best I can. Now, then you're a commoner? Mr. Purcell slapped the table with his palm. If you please, I'm asking the questions. Take up your protractor. We shall move on to geometry. Shortly after his 8th birthday, Nathaniel's curriculum was expanded. He began to study chemistry and physics on the one hand, and the history of religion on the other. He also began several other key languages, including Latin, Aramaic, and Hebrew. These activities occupied Nathaniel from 9 in the morning until lunch at 1, at which time he would descend to the kitchen to devour in solitude the sandwiches that Mrs. Underwood had left out for him under a moist cling film wrapper. In the afternoons, the timetable was varied. On 2 days of the week, Nathaniel continued work with Mr. Purcell. On 2 other afternoons, he was escorted down the road to a public baths, where a burly man with a mustache shaped like a mudguard supervised a punishing regimen. Along with a bedraggled posse of other small children, Nathaniel had to swim countless links using every conceivable style of stroke. He was always too shy and exhausted to talk much to his fellow swimmers, and they, sensing him for what he was, kept their distance from him. Already, by the age of 8, he was avoided and left alone. The other 2 afternoon activities were music, Thursday, and drawing, Saturday. Nathaniel dreaded music even more than swimming. His tutor, Mr. Sindra, was an obese, short-tempered man whose chins quivered as he walked. Nathaniel kept a close eye on those chins. If their trembling increased, it was a sure sign of coming rage. Rages came with depressing regularity. Mr. Sindra could barely contain his fury whenever Nathaniel rushed his scales, misread his notes, or fluffed his sight reading. And these things happened often.
How,
Mr. Sindra yelled,
do you propose to summon a Lamia with plucking like this? How? The mind boggles! Give me that!
He snatched the lyre from Nathaniel's hand and held it against his ample chest. Then, his eyes closed in rapture, he began to play. A sweet melody filled the workroom. The short, fat fingers moved like dancing sausages across the strings. Outside, birds stopped in the tree to listen. Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears. Memories from the distant past drifted ghost-like before him.
Now you!
The music broke off with a jarring screech. The lyre was thrust back at him. Nathaniel began to pluck at the strings. His fingers tripped and stumbled. Outside, several birds dropped from their tree in a stupor. Mr. Sindra's jowls shook like cold tapioca.
You idiot! Stop! Do you want the Lamia to eat you? She must be charmed, not roused to fury. Put down that poor instrument. We shall try the pipes.
Pipes or lyre, choral voice or sistrum rattle. Whatever Nathaniel tried, his faltering attempts met with bellows of outrage and despair. It was a far cry from his drawing lessons, which proceeded peacefully and well under his tutor, Miss Lutyens. Willowy and sweet-tempered, she was the only one of his teachers to whom Nathaniel could talk freely. Like Mrs. Underwood, she had little time for his nameless status. In confidence, she had asked him to tell her his name, and he had done so without a second thought. "Why," he asked her one spring afternoon, as they sat in the workroom with a fresh breeze drifting through the open window, "why do I spend all my time copying this pattern? It is both difficult and dull. I would much rather be drawing the garden, or this room, or you, Miss Lutyens." She laughed at him. "Sketching is all very well for artists, Nathaniel, or for rich young women with nothing else to do. You are not going to become an artist or a rich young woman, and the purpose for you picking up your pencil is very different. You are to be a craftsman, a technical draughtsman. You must be able to reproduce any pattern you wish, quickly, confidently, and above all else, accurately." He looked dismally at the paper resting on the table between them. It showed a complex design of branching leaves, flowers, and foliage, with abstract shapes fitted snugly in between. He was recreating the image in his sketchbook, and had been working on it for 2 hours without a break. He was about halfway finished.
It just seems pointless, that's all,
he said in a small voice.
Pointless it is not,
Miss Lutyens replied.
Let me see your work. Well, it's not bad, Nathaniel. Not bad at all. But look, do you not think that this cupola is rather bigger than the original? See here? And you've left a hole in this stem. It's rather a bad mistake. It's only a small mistake. The rest's okay, isn't it? That's not the issue. If you were copying out a pentacle and you left a hole in it, what would happen? It would cost you your life. You don't want to die just yet, do you, Nathaniel? No? Well then, you simply mustn't make mistakes. They'll have you else.
Miss Lutyens sat back in her chair.
By rights, I should get you to start again with this. Miss Lutyens! Mr. Underwood would expect no less.
She paused, pondering.
But, from your cry of anguish, I suppose it would be useless to expect you to do any better the second time round. We will stop for today. Why don't you go out into the garden? You look like you could do with some fresh air.
For Nathaniel, the garden of the house was a place of temporary solitude and retreat. No lessons took place there. It had no unpleasant memories. It was long and thin and surrounded by a high wall of red brick. Climbing roses grew against this in the summer, and 6 apple trees shed white blossoms over the lawn. 2 rhododendron bushes sprawled widthway halfway down the garden. Beyond them was a sheltered area, largely concealed from the many gaping windows of the house. Here, the grass grew long and wet. A horse chestnut tree in a neighboring garden towered above, and a stone seat, green with lichen, rested in the shadows of the wall. Beside the seat was a marble statue of a man holding a fork of lightning in his hand. He wore a Victorian-style jacket and had a gigantic pair of sideburns that protruded from his cheeks like the pincers of a beetle. The statue was weather-worn and coated with a thin mantle of moss, but still gave an impression of great energy and power. Nathaniel was fascinated by it, and had even gone so far as to ask Mrs. Underwood who it was, but she had only smiled.
Ask your master,
she said.
He knows everything.
But Nathaniel had not dared ask. This restful spot, with its solitude, its stone seat and its statue of an unknown magician, was where Nathaniel came whenever he needed to compose himself before a lesson with his cold, forbidding master.